Well, hello. I want to start this video by asking you a question. Is there one person at work, it seems like no matter where you work, who just drives you crazy, who you can't stand? Or do you always seem to have bosses who are completely impossible, who can just reduce you to tears with their demands or the fact that no matter what you do, they're never happy? Or do you really do more than your share at work and you're like resentful? You feel like you're carrying all the weight. People don't appreciate all of the work that you do. So you walk around kind of resentful at your coworkers. My name is Terri Cole. I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I am a relationship and boundary expert, and I'm the founder of upcoming Boundary Bootcamp. So in today's video, I want to talk to you about Boundary Bootcamp for the office or at work. How can you create effective boundaries in a work situation? What are the things that you need to consider? And what does it really mean, drawing boundaries at work? It's the same thing as drawing boundaries in your real life and in your relationships. It means speaking up, right? Talking about your preferences, showing people what your limits are, whether it is a physical boundary that you draw with someone, the way that you're interacting with someone that you work with, or whether it's an emotional boundary, or whether it is a boundary on your time, or whether it's an internal boundary that you need to draw yourself to make the situation healthy. So let's just start with the fact that boundaries themselves, our boundaries, your own personal boundary style, is not random. So let's start with that. It isn't random, right? There are a specific set of circumstances as you grow up in a particular family system at a particular time in history, in a particular place in the world. And all of those things dictate how you relate, how you interact with other people in personal relationships and in work situations. So these are things that if you're not good at drawing boundaries at work, if you feel like you don't get your needs met, so don't beat yourself up too much. Just know that this is a skill that you can actually learn if you want to. So some of the factors that impact how you relate, there's sort of relational boundaries when you're talking about the work situation, right? How are you interacting with either coworkers? How do you interact with authority figures? How do you interact with subordinates? These are all types of interactional boundaries. So some of the factors that create how you draw boundaries or don't draw boundaries in your professional life have to do with the models of behavior that you witnessed growing up, right? You have to think about this. Many of the things that you learned in the home that you grew up in were great, were very adaptive, were awesome, and many of them weren't. So what do I do on this YouTube channel, in my podcast, in my videos, in my blog? I'm trying to give you the tools and strategies, sort of fill in the gap of the things that you didn't get. So just know that I know that you got great things as well, because we all did. But it doesn't help you for us to really talk about that, right? What helps you is me filling in the things that maybe you didn't learn well, or things that you learned dysfunctionally, unhealthily. And my job is to help you unlearn the dysfunctional interaction and to learn something that will actually add value. In this situation, because we're talking about at the office, it'll add value to your success, right? So I want to establish a few things before we get into the how-to of drawing boundaries at work, is really establishing that you have to have truly given yourself permission to draw boundaries. Really looking at, do you think you have a right to let your preference be known? To say no if you have to say no to something. And I'm not talking about something within your job description necessarily. I'm talking about not speaking up, not honoring how you really feel. Another reason that it's so crucial that you learn to draw boundaries at work, speak up, speak authentically, is because how will anyone know how smart, how creative, how amazing you are if you never share authentically and don't speak up and talk about your ideas, or say no to crappy ideas that you think are bad if someone is asking you? Because if you're so afraid to say no, you're not letting them see your real genius, right? That's in there. And the second thing I want you to think about before we get into the actual boundary setting part is to really dial into the wisdom of your body. Your body, when you're in a work situation and a home situation too, but right now in this video, I want to talk about boundary boot camp at the office. If you feel constricted, if you feel resentful or guilty, especially if it's a repeated situation, like it happens with one person sort of over and over again, this is a sign that perhaps a boundary needs to be drawn, because you don't want to walk around that way. I want you to look at that. When you start feeling that constriction inside, or that person starts talking and you're like, ugh, I can't stand them, instead of just gossiping about them with someone else, which doesn't help anything and is such a terribly low vibration, I'd rather you not do it at all. Really look at, what is it about them that is making me crazy? What am I really pissed off about? What is really impacting me right now? Because if you can figure out the real origin of what you're mad at, and then realize that you need to have a conversation with them. In the videos that I'm putting out and the Boundary Bootcamp Challenge that's coming in September, you can learn the healthy language of boundaries. But you can't ignore the signs and symbols that your body is telling you, or you won't know when to draw them. So be mindful if you feel resentful, constricted, and guilty. Guilty is a weird one, but it's a true story. Feeling guilty about something or someone, that means a conversation most likely needs to happen. And one thing that might be counterintuitive, and you might not even understand how this is the case, if you are an overgiver, which I know many of you are because we've had many conversations, an overdoer, an overdeliverer, someone who has the perfectionist complex, and you start feeling resentful that you're not being appreciated enough at work, maybe the boundary that you need to draw is actually within you, that you need to look at your own behavior. Because if you're doing things like bringing food into the office or organizing lunches for everyone or whatever it is that you're doing, and you don't feel like people are appreciating you, this is you sort of sabotaging yourself at work, because no one's asking you to do those things. And if you overgive and overfunction and overwork and take on other people's responsibilities, expecting them to be uber grateful, they most likely won't be, right? Because they're in denial themselves that you're doing their work probably. And it really sets you up to just be bitter, and you end up with that martyr complex of like, ugh, poor me, it's always me, I'm always doing all the work. And that will not make you successful at work, but it also is like boring to be around. It's like complaining about the same things over and over. So you want to be able to dial into that internal boundary that you may need to draw and stop yourself. Really use the restraint from overgiving and pour yourself into what actually is your job description, what they're actually paying you to do. And it's also a way to protect your own energy. Because you guys, even if you're young, the truth is we have a limited amount of prana, life force energy, that we can expend in a day, right? And if you're expending a lot of energy on stuff that isn't even yours to expend it on, you're really doing a disservice to your projects or what your primary job actually is. If it's an internal boundary that you need to draw, and that you feel really confident that you've given yourself permission to draw boundaries and to recognize where you need to draw them, I'm going to give you a couple of steps to take before you decide to draw boundaries or have that difficult conversation, so that your side of the street is very clean with what it is that you're doing. So the first thing you're going to do is you want to check out if you may be having what I call a repeating reality. Are you responding to someone that you work with in a particular way because of something that you have previously experienced? Those of you who've watched many of my videos, you know that I always talk about the 3 Qs. And most of the time we're talking about the 3 Qs in romantic relationships or even friendships. But the 3 Qs are also totally valuable when we're talking about work and boundaries. So what are the 3 Qs? When you find yourself in a situation with someone and you're starting to feel that constriction or that resentment or that guilt that I was just talking about, you start with the 3 Qs, which is, where have I felt like this before? Who does this person remind me of? And why is this behavioral dynamic or the way that we're interacting familiar to me? And don't worry, I'm going to have a whole little cheat sheet. It's a boot camp strategy thing that you're going to be able to download so that you will have it with you in a work situation. So you don't have to take notes right now, but then the 3 Qs will be included in that. But I want you to really think about it. If you bring to mind someone at work who you can't stand or who you had an ongoing conflict with, and you ask the 3 Qs, you might get some insight into what repeating reality is happening for you. So, example of this is I had a client who every the whole time I was working with her, she had 3 different jobs. And at every job, she ended up having a woman who became like her arch nemesis, someone who she hated, and that person hated her as well. And she said to me, well, this is like normal. I'm sure this happens, for everyone. I'm like, no. This is happening specifically to you for a reason. And you are participating in this for a reason. This is not about Mary, not about Jessica, not about Bonnie, which were the people who she hated. So by the last one, I was like, let's look at the fact that you are the common denominator in all of these situations. So she was like, okay. And I asked her to tell me about the 3 Qs, who deserve. And then, we were able to establish she had a terrible relationship with one of her sisters who was very close in age to her and whatever. And she was trying to work out this sort of unresolved trauma that this bully of a sister created in her. And once we started talking about what it was really about, do you think that at that next job that she had a person who was her arch nemesis? No, she did not. Because she did not have a repeating reality, which is this unresolved crap from childhood, relationships, injuries, traumatic things that have happened, that if you're not aware of them, you may just be playing them out at work. A lot of times what I find really common is that a client will be basically reconstructing their family of origin in their work situation. So think about that. Are you always drawn, if your dad was kind of a bully, are you always drawn to a boss who's kind of a bully? Or if your father was very quiet, as mine was, did you always find yourself with bosses who were withdrawn and cold and whatever it is? So these are things that are really helpful, because once you establish in an interaction, if you have a conflict with someone at work that you feel like you need to talk about, when you can really get clear about what is your side of the street, it makes it so much easier to come to a resolution. Because once you get, or my client got, that Bonnie was not her sister, she was like, wow, like I'm having a transference. I'm overreacting to this person because of these other injuries. And as we figured out those other injuries, this Bonnie person no longer had the power to push her buttons in the same way, because it wasn't just my client who was acting something out. It was also the other person. Okay, so let's move on to things for you to consider. The context is created by where you are. So the context for the boundaries themselves is really dictated by where you are. So if you are in a social situation and you need to draw a boundary with a friend, you're going to be looking at what is the social norm of that group that you hang around with. Do people tell each other the truth or don't they? If you decide to tell this person the truth, is it going to be gossiped about or whatever? A work situation is the same thing. So where you are really supplies the context for the boundaries that are appropriate. So what I think is appropriate for you to figure out in a work situation is completely different for a personal situation or a romantic situation. You also have to understand that work situations, so every corporation has their own corporate culture around boundaries, communication, protocol. If it's a big corporation, they have a human resources department that can basically help you if you're having a conflict with someone. And they definitely have rules and regulations about how you go about it, who you tell what's happening. In smaller companies, or if you're working as a solopreneur or an entrepreneur, then you're really left to your own devices to figure out how to communicate effectively, get your needs met, get a fair deal, or whatever it is that you do for your business. But I just want you to consider that the forum in which you are considering drawing these boundaries really creates that context of A, how easy or difficult it's going to be for you to draw them, but B, what is and isn't appropriate. So it's always important to consider that before you get into drawing the boundary. And lastly, the energy that you bring into this process has everything to do with how this process will go. So if you can discover that you have a repeating reality, you have a fear of confrontation because you weren't allowed to have a confrontation in the family you grew up in, you've really got to unpack that a little bit. And I've got many, many videos right here on YouTube that you can look up about repeating realities and asking the 3 Qs and downloaded blueprints. And that will give you some guidance as to how to look at some unresolved things. If you discover, like, wow, I've been relating to this person as my mean sister or mean brother or whatever it is, then what do you do? Because you really need to unpack that and journal about that and write about it so that it's no longer driving your behavior, right? This is what we don't want to happen. And when that is done and you're positive that you've given yourself permission to draw boundaries in a professional setting, and you're dialed into your body and you're being mindful as to when you're feeling resentful so that you can say something sooner rather than later, that is when you know that you're ready to actually have a conversation with someone. This is where you dial into what energy are you going to bring to that conversation. Don't make it a big deal. Whoever wants to talk to someone when they say, I really have to talk to you. Like, anyone says that, I'm like, oh God, the last thing I want to do is talk to this person because I know it's going to be all dramatic and I don't need it. If you normalize, if you really believe and understand that you have a right to draw these boundaries, you can make it very casual. It can be a simple request about someone being late. If they're going to be late to the meeting, please let us know. About someone following the protocol of how they're supposed to be reporting to you or to someone else or whatever the situation may be. If you go into it in a super fear-based way energetically, that other person or that group of people are going to react to that. So I really want you to get clear in your mind and in your body that you're doing this, and this is something that's good to do for everyone. You're not drawing boundaries for other people, but you are drawing boundaries so that other people, you're giving them a clue as to how to interact with you, rather than suffering silently and becoming more and more angry about it. And listen, maybe you're the one who needs to work on your boundaries. Maybe you're being intrusive at work, and this may be a repetition as well. So it's not always just that you're not drawing boundaries. Maybe your expectation or you're being codependent and taking on too many things, and that's a bad boundary as well. So I know that this was long because boundaries are complicated yet super simple, right? What are boundaries? Letting people know what your preference is. Letting people know what is and is not okay with you. As Brene Brown says, that's the basis of boundaries. So if you guys liked this video, if you like this information, please share it on social media. And if you have not yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do. I also want to give you the heads up that we do have Boundary Bootcamp Challenge coming up end of August, early September 2017. So keep your eyes open for that because it's going to be awesome. I hope you guys have an amazing week. And as always, take care of you.